Okay. Spilo did a interview with Aaron Keller and Alec Dawson here, clearly. So I'm gonna respond to some of the things that they said. I made a couple of bookmarks here. I'm just gonna go through. First one here says single tank focus. Let's see what I think it's Alec Dawson has to say.
And when
I
it
got to
won't,
give some
right?
examples. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure. I mean, overall, the way we look at it, and tanks in particular, right now in 5v5, a lot of their value is in like personal uptime, right? And now we have a second tank in the mix in 2v2. We actually had to like cut back a lot on that, right? Because now the value of tanks is coordinating your cooldowns and like cycling and things of that nature. So we had to create some windows of opportunity
Yeah. Yeah.
in terms of.
Okay. So this is what I've been talking about like with 5v5 and the way that you when you super buff a tank, it's based off of raw stats versus how you use your abilities. And he just said so right here. Like the value of a tank is your uptime. Overwatch, in Overwatch 2, the value you bring is because of the fact that you are such a raw stat monster that you being alive matters more than necessarily you securing kills or outplaying people through the use of your abilities. uh, that creates the player frustration on the other end, which it feels like you can't outplay that situation. There's nothing you could have done differently without the help of your team. Like it is very much dependent on the fact that like you need your team to back you up with this now super monster that you've created.
Mitigation and in terms of things of that nature. So if you look at all the individual tanks, like the health pools go down, like the tank passive in terms of the health, in terms of crit reduction, that goes away. They still and the knockback reduction goes away as well. They still maintain their ult charge generation reduction, so I think that's fairly important, just so ults aren't happening too much within the space.
Yep.
But they lose out that all that other stuff, and then a lot of their cooldowns go up. Right, a lot of the cooldowns go up because we have to create more moments of opportunity for players.
Those windows of opportunity are important because of the fact that what happened with like the tank buffs that they created when they were just like, oh, we're going to change Zarya's bubbles from like 2 seconds to 2.5 seconds long, or increase Ryan's shield or whatever. Like you need to give uh, those open opportunities, open windows in which you can recognize that there is a mistake and that there's a reasonable window in which you can capitalize on that mistake that they made. So yes, like this is the kind of thing that you need to have to promote healthy gameplay. So that way it feels like you as a player, can learn and be like, oh, I see that window and now I should capitalize on that window. But if there is no window and it's just constantly just like shoot, 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 and just keep nonstop shooting, like it gets very boring very fast.
And you don't want all that mitigation happening all the time.
Right.
So things like Ramacho's barrier goes up by a few seconds, right, in terms of when it can respawn again, right? Stuff of that nature. Broadly, that's how we're looking at that for tanks. And then but we aren't getting rid of all of the passives. I think DPS passives still in there. We think that's actually plays out pretty well. Like healing mitigation can be pretty useful for us.
Mhm.
And
Please get rid of the passive and just nerf the healing. Please just get rid of the passive and nerf the healing. Players can't see the passive. Tanks can't see the passive. So when the tanks are on the front line and they're attacking somebody, they don't know who has the passive on them. They don't know who it's applied to. Nerf the healing so that the tanks have kill potential and it isn't inconsistent. Please, I'm begging you, Alex. Please, Alec. Sorry. Please, I'm begging you to nerf the healing and get rid of the DPS passive, please.
and also overall, we don't want as much clutter. So just like
Yeah.
it adds another
More
thing to
crap on
the
the
world.
floor. Yeah.
If we can get rid of that, we will. I think
Yeah.
even you'll see across the cast anything that has like a long duration that stays in the play space, such as like Tree of Life, right? Cage Fight from Malga. Those all just have time reductions on them too. Their duration is down,
Awesome.
right?
Awesome.
So because we don't want more and more of that. Same with CC. We're not introducing Maze Freeze back in, right? We are going to keep that level of soft CC and not introduce hard CC that we had previously.
Wait a second. So I'm like,
Okay, I agree with like removing of the visual clutter. You want to be careful, but a lot of the like support abilities like Tree of Life, like Kitsune, there's a lot of things that are massive AoE abilities that I think that we should do less of, and even honestly rework certain ultimates to do something a little bit more creative and a little bit more choicey. Because the massive AoE damage ram out, the massive AoE healing from supports of different kinds, because it's always the same. Like I think that we're not getting enough creative options for the different supports because Beat, Tranquility, um, Tree of Life, and Orbital Ray all work so extremely similar to one another that I've noticed that even as me playing Zarya fully charged, Orbital Ray, which would give more healing or give healing and damage, like if I grab someone and they're in that, they still don't die to me at like 95% charge. So it's like, what's the difference between that and tranquility then in terms of like, if it gives more damage, why is the healing still strong enough to stop a tank ultimate? Like, I I I agree that we need less visual clutter, but like to me, there are certain heroes that are bigger offenders to this. I think like Magna Cage Fight is not the worst thing in the world. I do think that like Ram Alt, Tree of Life, Orbital Ray, like those are the ones that I would first kind of like go to and try and find a more unique way that offers more player choice, but also more player counterplay.
The game theory, right? So before we start talking about the testing logistics, this is the saucy one. This is the one that's tough because one of the big criticisms of the 5v5 format is that it does feel like you said uptime for tank, a lot of mitigation, a lot of power shifted to the tank, a lot of responsibility shifted to tank. It disenfranchises enabler tanks like Zarya Diva to an extent, creates or maybe a raid boss tank problem. Feels like relevance of counter swapping the tank in different situations. Do you believe or do you know from any of your testing that 66 deals with some of those issues from what you guys have seen?
Definitely some of those issues. I think in six, look, there are other issues that pop up, right?
Yeah.
And let's make that clear. But some of the issues that we're talking about right now do get helped in some way. I think off tanks have a more clear role. They are able to peel more. They are also able to kind of venture on their own a little bit more too, because they don't have that responsibility of always protecting the team or at least feeling.
This is the problem of like solo tank, where when you have one off tank, you have the ability to control space, but also deal with certain issues in terms of mitigating problems. Widow is as powerful as she is in 5v5 because of one, map design, and two, there's nobody there to deal with her other than just doing another counter Widow, going Sombra, or another flanker like Tracer or Genji. But sometimes on maps like Circuit Royale, you can't necessarily close the distance due to the map design in order to deal with that hero. And Sombra got nerfed so hard that Widow became super oppressive as of recently because her rework was just, or her newest rework was just bad. Um, yeah, the off tanks are, there to help peel and help deal with a lot of issues, and a lot of the tank blame and frustration comes from the fact that players who don't play tank expect the tank to push and control space, to deal with the enemy tank, also deal with the enemy widow, and do everything on top of it, while a lot of times shifting that blame towards the tank, which makes the role frustrating because it's not even necessarily the tank players aren't having fun. We just don't like getting yelled at for 20 minutes while our Hanzo's 7 and 11 and we're 15 and 1, but we're told to switch in order to deal with the tank that they can't seem to handle. Like that is part of why 6v6 arguments seem to me work and make a lot more sense because of the fact that you're just expected to do everything on your own.
Feeling like they have to, or their team, or their own team asking for them to do that the whole time, right?
Mhm.
And not trying to take care of themselves. And there's another element of pressure that is definitely the
Yep.
valve is released a little bit, right? When you look at the scoreboard, there isn't a clear person on your team as many times that is maybe the reason you're losing or what you think is the reason you're losing. So especially in the tank role, you're not going to feel that because that's where people go to. Let's be honest. Like
Yeah.
right now, all the time they point to their tank if they're winning or losing, whether it be someone else's fault, right? Unless that's very clear, even if it's kind of
I can't tell, and I'm gonna hammer this down again. I can't tell you how many games I've played where I am like legitimately 20 and 3 and I have DPS or supports yelling at me who have like 12 deaths themselves after the first round. They're like, "Hey, you need to do something about this." And I'm like, I'm securing kills and I'm playing smart and I can't convince you to have better positioning. I can't convince you to do this because a lot of these players don't know how to deal with a raid boss tank and don't have the positional understanding to know when to back up. And it's like, like I said, you're trying to deal with the enemies who are a problem. And if the enemy team has something like a widow that's an issue, but if you go and you dive the widow, there's nobody there to then deal with the tank. But if you deal with the tank, there's nobody then there to deal with the widow. And when you're the only solo tank player, it's just you, especially without the DPS passive and everything is healing at full. Like it's a very frustrating experience in that you can't secure kills, but you also can't control the space and deal with the problems at the same time. To me, the identity of tank isn't necessarily to secure kills super quickly. You do want to be able to do that, but it's more so you want to create abilities that allow them to disrupt and protect the team. I think that like Zarya's bubbles, Winston bubbles, Ryan holding shield, but also having the limit of like not having range. Like these are the things like Ryan players, I would imagine, like being able to block incoming attacks through the use of their skill. Same with like Winston. When you dive in Anna and you predict her sleep and nade and you bubble it correctly, that feels very rewarding. Like to me, that's what you want to do. You don't want to make sure that tanks survive through everything. You want to make sure they have abilities that allow them to counterplay their problems. But a lot of what Overwatch's 2 problem is the fact that the super tanks are so powerful that if the enemy tank feels like it's running over your team, they're gonna blame you, and, you could still be doing good and it doesn't matter.
kind of like middling, that's probably who they point to. So that gets spread out, and I think that actually for some folks makes the game much more enjoyable because they don't
For the mental health of tank players, that's why we need 6v6 because like, trust me, they're going crazy.
feel that constant like intensity that maybe 5v5 does have a little bit of, right?
It
So
actually spikes fairly well in 6v6. So the teams don't really fold the same way in 6v6, or a team fight doesn't necessarily play out the same way. Where if a tank goes down, it's typically over.
If a tank goes down, the fight is typically over. Now, if you are in Overwatch 2, if you're playing Overwatch 2 and you see that you have like a Doomfist or something that just likes to compete repeatedly dive in without waiting for his team. He's not in voice. He doesn't respond to any text, and he just jumps out of spawn, jumps in, and at the end of the game, he has 27 deaths, and the enemy ball has 4. You are never winning that game. Ever. It is physically impossible due to the fact that that one super tank has so much value that you you know that if you solo alt a tank you win that fight. When you make one player have the super stats, you create a more valuable player than everyone else. And I'm glad to hear that like Aaron says that and like recognizes it, but this is what I'm talking about when I say that like the Overwatch 2 problem is when you give that many super stats and make one more character more important than the others, you create this problem in which you want to make people focus them. You want to create this problem where everybody wants to look and solo alt and kill this one person because that brings value to your team. And before, when it was already like, hey, we buff tanks in Overwatch 2, they have a little bit more health to deal with the fact that they're solo. Everyone quickly realized, like, oh, if we solo alt, that's probably the most value, right? Like, it's realistically, like, it might bring the most value to kill just this one person because they have more stats, but, like, it's arguable 'cause even when it was first released, like, they had less health, so it was, like, not, it wasn't always a for sure winning situation. And then they buffed all the tanks to do whatever they did better, made counter swapping worse, and then made them more valuable. So now it is 100% worth it in Overwatch 2 in this current patch to solo alt the tank and kill them every time. It doesn't matter if you die for it. It is 100% worth it because as long as your tank is still standing, the enemy team can't do anything about it. And that is the frustrating problem from 6v6 to 5v5 argument is that and saying like a lot of people say like, oh, because there's one less player on the map, you have more 8-player agency. But it doesn't matter if you are unable to kill an enemy tank on your own or deal with that tank as a problem because of the fact that if your tank is dead, you cannot win that fight. You have less agency, you have less control. It requires you to have more teamwork and it just creates a very frustrating one-dimensional experience. And that's the reason why I keep trying to hammer away at like we need to fix this problem. Even if you want to stick with 5v5, that's fine, but you can't have one single player have the health of 2 players and be able to survive so much more and control that space. Like it creates this very messed up unequal dynamic.
The moment the tank goes down on your team, the remaining tank has that pressure
Mm.
on them. But it almost feels good where it's like, here's the moment I can stand up and try to hold, and like you do have the ability to hold sometimes, or at least more than you would in the 5v5.
By the way, if people haven't figured it out in Overwatch 2, the best way to play tank isn't necessarily to secure kills. It's literally just stay alive as long as possible. Like your priority is to live, not make plays. That's the reason why tank. One of the reasons why tank is frustrating.
World. So sometimes it's nice to be able to have that moment where you are able to kind of like pull everything together without having to have it for the entire match.
That
yeah,
makes sense.
and also dueling tanks. Tanks are still very strong. Yeah, they still have definitely quite good dueling capability. But if you get 1v1 on one and you feel like you outplay them, you actually might come out of that fight,
Right.
winning it. Whereas right now, I think there's many times where you can feel like that can be very, very difficult, right? So those are some things that definitely I think help the 6v6 experience. But there's other issues that pop up too.
I'm sure there's other issues for 6v6 experience, but what he just said is super important because of the fact that like you cannot duel a tank in the 5v5 format. If If you were playing Tracer in Overwatch 1 and you came up against a Roadhog, if he missed his hook and he messed up his vape, he was vulnerable. You could kill him. In Overwatch 2, you could kill everybody on the team. But, like, the moment that like, if the only person left and you're playing Tracer, the only person left on the enemy team is a Roadhog, you will not win that fight. Due to the sustain, due to the maximum amount of health, due to his, abilities naturally countering her, you do not win that fight, and this is what creates more player frustration is because then I'm blaming the game because I can't do anything in this scenario. You did not give me the tools to handle this situation, so I have to blame the game, I have to blame my team because I know I stayed alive, I did my job. But because I'm in a situation that the game has put me in where I will no matter what fail, it doesn't matter. Like people need the ability to dual tanks. Yes, they're strong. Yes, they need to have more health because that's a tank. Yes, they need to have skills that mitigate damage. But if if they make mistakes and they're still able to stay alive and not be punished for it, it creates a very frustrating experience. Like you do not as a game designer want to create an experience where you motivate your players to blame the game or their teammates. And that is exactly what Overwatch 2 has done and why it's so frustrating for a lot of players. Like whether they know it or not, that's what's happening.
In like in Overwatch, like the original game, there's a lot like people use the term heal bot. You know, you just feel like there's so many hit points and so much damage. You know, like heading into your team that a lot of times it's all you can do. And when Overwatch 2 launched, there was like this support issue with the game. And we talked about it back in the days, like supports felt like they were being picked on and stuff like that. And I think that that's some of it, but also like the way you play support, it requires like a different mindset and a different play style in Overwatch 2 because you're making plays now. And so it feels different. So like what we saw like in our stats was before we really started making some of the changes to supports early in the game, and also I think with people kind of like coming to grips with what was required with them, the role started fairly unpopular and really rose over like the first season or two in popularity pretty quickly. To where like even at the start it was probably around tank levels. The amount of
Wow.
people queuing for
I did
support
not
it
know
was
that.
really low. Um,
The queue times are directly relevant as to based off of like how powerful people feel the role is. Now, I can't see the numbers exactly, so maybe there's something else that they're saying that I'm not. However, currently the reason why tank isn't fun is because of the fact that supports are so powerful. Is the reason why I made so many videos talking about how like everything that a support does just negates tanks, especially because of the fact that they're much slower in terms of their time to kill versus a DPS, and they don't have the DPS passive, and their ultimates are countered by the basic abilities of supports. So, in order to get value, it's much easier to get value as a support for much less work than it is as a tank. And not only that, you take all the blame for it. Like, if you want to address like the tank queue times, even in 5v5, if you even want to address it in 5v5, you cannot have supports be this strong. Like you cannot be able to sit in the safest position behind your entire team with the strongest abilities that are the easiest to land and ultimates that always guarantee value uh, and give them all of this power and then not expect that to be the most queued role because people find that just like, oh, it's fun because I have all this power. Whereas the tank, you don't get to see what's going on behind you. You can't see who the DPS passive is applied to. You have to be very specific about when you time your ults because everything, basic abilities on DPS and supports can counter it. And even just regular ults can counter your stuff. Like you are a punching bag with not a lot of kill potential and so much more time to kill. And uh, just everybody negates you. Like this is the problem of tank and the reason why it's not fun right now is because of the fact that supports are just too freaking strong. Like I say this as someone who's played all roles. Like I understand too the DPS role is also really strong. Like but supports for how difficult they are to play like yield just too much value and that like when they yield that much value it's always chipping away at the tank's fun. Like supports are just too strong. Nerf them. Nerf them. Redesign a lot of their abilities so that way there's more margin for error and there's more creative skill expression. And change it to where their alts have more choice instead of just guaranteed free value. Because otherwise, like you're going to continue to have low tank queue times because it's just a whole lot less rewarding than it is to play, say, something into like Ana or Kiriko or Bap.
And it kind of like really took off after that. We definitely needed to make some changes to it, but I also think people needed to kind of like recognize what they were doing. And as a whole, right now, I do think support is kind of like it's a much more engaging role than it was in Overwatch One. You know, so that is going to be like we're talking about like when you talk about game theory, a lot of times people focus it on tanks and the tank experience, and I think there's parts of the tank experience that are better in 6v6. It doesn't necessarily mean that all the other ones are.
Interesting. So you're looking at it from a perspective of that with support. Once you got over that initial learning curve, there's more, maybe I hate to use the term agency, but there's more playmaking involved within the Overwatch 2. And so finding ways to maintain that during your 6v6 tests is a priority.
Yes, definitely.
I don't know exactly what they're, getting at here. Like maybe they lose players because of the fact that support wasn't strong enough, and maybe that's why they did it. I'm not sure. I'm just kind of confused, I guess. And I'm like, I'm trying really hard to understand. But, when you take away, when you like in 6v6, when you give more control over to tanks and allow them to feel better and allow them to take off some of that like harsh responsibility, and you give them that more control and it takes it away from support, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing because of the fact that there is supposed to be that trade-off, right? Like, is it not? Uh, you want to be able to make sure that everybody feels like they can have some sort of meaningful impact. And if one role is directly impacting another role, then you would want to address that that balance and make sure that it's a fair balance. Like, uh, I don't know. To me, I know what I would change. I I hear what they say a lot of times, and I do agree with them on a lot of what they want to do. I just don't understand like what they say versus like what their actions are sometimes. So like, I don't know.
We think it's an overall more enjoyable experience.
Great.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, and I don't want to make this all about the players like, hey, you're all playing wrong. It wasn't
Sure.
that. I mean, we had some really powerful flanking heroes
course.
when Overwatch 2 launched, and there was some issues just with support that we needed to. I mean, the support passive, came out of this time.
Right.
You know, so there's a lot that we did. So like, I don't want this to turn into like us saying like just learn to play.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Of course. Of course. What do you feel about the DPS rules impact here in terms of the 66 compared to 5v5? Do you notice any change in playstyles or impact between those rules?
I mean, there is less space, but you have the opportunity to coordinate, with that off tank perhaps, and so you see it's kind of buddy up sometimes, things like that. But you don't get to, flank as freely, I think, as you do now. I think a lot.
You don't get to flank as freely. However, because of the fact that you can now duel players more easily because of like the lower health pools, and it's more based off of like your abilities and how you use them versus just raw stats. I'm sure it feels a lot better in 6v6 knowing that if you are playing Tracer and you encounter a Roadhog, you can beat that tank. Or, you know, if you're playing soldier or something and like diva jumps on you, but you know she has a lower health pool, maybe you can still survive and take her out despite the fact that you're hard countered by her. Right? It doesn't just because you have less space to work in doesn't mean like when the players encounter that situation, they'll feel as frustrated as they do in Overwatch 2. Because like what's the point in having more space but feeling like you didn't have anything you could do without the help of your team? Like it doesn't matter if you have more space to work if you can't do anything in that space anyway. Especially with your own individual player agency, because that's what I value more than just saying like teamwork. Because teamwork was always there in Overwatch 1 when there was player agency, but it was teamwork with the individual agency. Overwatch 2 is like 90% teamwork.
A lot of times in 5v5, you can take a whole flank and that might just be yours, right?
Right. That's true.
It's not, it doesn't really happen that way in 66 as much, right? But at the same time, now you're able to dual tanks and you're able to kind of take them down a bit quicker. So I think there are advantages there in terms of how you feel and your capabilities, right?
Sure. Makes sense.
And this is why I say like player perception matters a whole lot more than just purely like balance or numbers, right? Uh, players who don't know the win rates and aren't chronically online checking subreddits or interviews like some of us are, like they're not going to understand that the Roadhog in front of them technically has like a 44% win rate and Roadhog's actually not that good. They're only going to understand that they were shooting at what they felt like was a brick wall for like 30 straight seconds and he landed one hook and he died. Like that's what players are going to feel and that's what they're going to understand. versus like the Reinhardt who charged in after them and they're just like, oh, maybe I got caught out of position because I allowed him to close that gap, right? Even if that Reinhardt had a 60% win rate, the player perception of what they felt like they could have done better matters more because as long as the player feels like they could do something to improve, then they'll keep playing your game. But if they don't feel like that, then they're just gonna like they're gonna leave. That's what makes people quit because people quit games when they blame the game instead of themselves.
I think
C6 comes back, does well, and is here to stay. We've talked a lot about queue times. I think you guys did a really good job, Aaron, you particularly in your dev blog, where you talked a lot about I still will have that bar chart seared into my memory between tank queues before and after, and what queue times look like. And I think that has been 5v5's strongest argument since then. And the question is, okay, we go back to 66, maybe from a strategical gameplay. Some people argue it's more sound, it provides more value with what Overwatch originally was. Okay, but queue times. My perspective has always been that a lot of the queue times argument does come from what were perceived as not as popular tanks when tank was the least popular role, whether that was the double shield or whatever else. But do you guys agree, and do you have any ideas or inspiration about how you would address queue times? And I know this is the big, ugly question. One of the things that you said was running, if we have 66, more tank players will naturally want to play 66. Maybe that's a factor that I had not considered. Tough question.
Yeah, I guess I could go into that a little bit. So there is like this world where if it's running, there are more tank players that go into it, and it could just naturally pull queue times down. If 6v6 wasn't as popular as 5v5, that might be all it takes. It's just something like that, and it wouldn't adversely affect the 5v5 queue times that much. So that's still kind of wishful thinking at this point, though. So like probably not the best idea is to just plan for that one to happen. So there are like some other things with queue times. There's the exact opposite world where let's say we put something up, a 6v6 test up, and it did have long queue times, but people just kept playing it anyways. That's saying a few things right there. One, that's saying that people enjoy it enough to where they actually are willing to wait, which means they must really like it. But it also means that like even if we're not able to find a solve for queue times, there's potentially an audience for this thing.
Right.
I don't know like if like it's not a huge gamble to keep it up and running in that world because there's a possibility that people just fall off, because they don't really want to stick with those queue times long term, and if they didn't, we could always just shut the mode down at that point. But if they did stick around, it could work that way. And then there's like lots of in-betweens here, and we could maybe get into some of the details, and I'm not even sure if everybody on the team agrees on all of the details, to where I think you brought it up about just like, hey, how enjoyable are some of the tanks in that world. And I talked about how supports kind of started off that way in Overwatch 2, and we were able to get them to a spot where they became more popular. So there is an example of us doing something to increase the popularity of a role. I'm not sure if there's a silver bullet there, though. Like if we were to have done that in Overwatch 1, like maybe we could have shifted the queue times.
I'm glad that like you like Aaron recognized that like in the beginning support was considered underpowered of Overwatch 2. So they buffed supports and gave them a lot of things that allowed them to survive longer and do more to the point that like season 8 I remember nothing died ever. It took so much work to kill anything because healing numbers were so out of control because there was so much AoE healing that was easy to hit. Uh, it just created this it they just got slowly buffed more and more and more and more and more over time and they had all these abilities and like then you have like life weaver because and you have kiriko and then bap on top of it, so there's three immortalities, and if you're playing against a team that's got both a bap and a kiriko, that's two immortalities you need to burn through before you're allowed to use your abilities, right? So we I highly I really just for like a quick play hacked weekend or something, do a like I want to see a test where we just get rid of the DPS passive, nerf healing, and then redesign immortality abilities to not be as effective as they are and design them into something else that provides a little bit more like counterplay and a little bit more creative skill expression on those players' parts rather than just pressing E at the ground and negating an ultimate or negating a kill of somebody stepping out of place. Cause like I've been playing Overwatch Classic, and one of the things that's extremely like extremely rewarding is knowing that when I'm playing a character, like I'm playing Cassidy or if I'm playing Tracer, I always say Tracer because like that's my default. But if I'm playing Tracer and I'm fighting a Roadhog, but I see that he missed his hook and he messed up his shots, and I see that as an opportunity, I can kill him. And with Cassidy, if I see that he messed up his flashbang, I can kill him. I was dying a lot more in Overwatch Classic, but I was securing a lot more kills as well because of the fact that I was doing so through the expression of my own skill rather than just the raw stats in front of me or given to me. Um, do something to make it to where you test this stuff to uh, increase the amount of kills people can secure uh, in Overwatch, right? Do it so you allow them to be proactive and reward players for being proactive rather than just being like what I feel like in Overwatch 2, my job as Tracer isn't to try and outplay someone, it's to try and bait cooldowns so that way hopefully my team can do something with those open opportunity windows. And I don't want to be the person that's just only there to annoy, distract, and bait cooldowns. I want to be there, be the one that's trying to make the plays. Like that's what I want to see Overwatch come back to is being a proactive game where you're trying to make plays versus just trying to defensively deny them.
I think we're cutting them in a third or something like that, or tripling the number of tanks that are queuing. We might be able to like make it a little bit better.
Like support is the most queued role because of the fact that it's the most powerful and the easiest to play. Like straight up.
And that really leads into my question here is like, it kind of, you've already answered it, but the idea is that like, what have you learned since Overwatch 1? Because I've always been very vocal about a lot of my criticisms, but also a lot of my support about some of the, how fast, how responsive that you guys are. And even little things like map reworks and reworks of this and changes to that. Like, I think people are going to see this when they go back to Overwatch Classic. It is a lot of fun, but it can be a bit of a mess, right? And I think how polished some of the game design and map design that you guys have learned since then. So I guess my question is, what about the environment within your development team, whether it's the experience or the trial and error that you guys have learned in the last 2 years that makes you feel more prepared to handle 66?
There's a few things like I can maybe talk about some of the philosophical changes a little bit as far as development goes, and maybe level design, and Alec can jump into some of the hero stuff. But like we do think that that just having a consistent, quicker cadence of updates to the game, especially when you talk about balance updates, is just healthy for the community. And it's we
I will say I do appreciate them for that. Even if I disagree with the patches and the updates and stuff, at least they're attempting to change things more frequently and quickly because when bad things happen in Overwatch 1, you're stuck with it for like a year. Like I'm just hoping that, you know, the direction of their changes and what they've been planning on switches uh to a direction more of what originally Overwatch felt like to play versus like what it is now.
we are always trying to make them good. So it's not, this isn't just variety for variety's sake, although it does provide variety to the game. And I think that is something that a certain amount of our players appreciate. But to be able to do this, I think it helps us build trust with the community that like, hey, this is just the way we want to run things from now on. Where like typically most seasons have 3 to 4 balance patches in them. The biggest one at the beginning, a decent sized one in the middle, and then a lot of times there's just going to be something that's happening in between there. So I think that stuff helps. And then we do just have like it's taken us a little while to let go of some of our old habits. I earlier just like made a comment about how when we first started development on Overwatch, we thought of it as like a really defensive oriented game. And we were looking at other games as inspiration. So something like Team Fortress 2 was something that we had played a lot and talked about a lot in early development. And we would use a couple of analogies. One was like we always wanted it to feel like there was like a battle line in the middle of a map, and like each team could understand which side of it they were on. Or we wanted it to feel like you kind of had to like crack the nut, like crack that nut of the defense and like try to be able to like get through. And a lot of our early map designs, like Temple of Anubis was first, where we put that stage up on top of that choke. And man, we really made you earn getting through that. And we reworked the map since that original one, because even that was too much. But we repeated a lot of those designs, like that happened in Eichenwald. Like, hey, can you get through? Can you get under that bridge? Or Paris.
So this is the problem of like map design where players need to have options, right? And they specifically, they focus it on a defense heavy thing where um a lot of the players' frustrations of certain heroes being overpowered is due to the fact that map design allows them to be so strong. Uh, when you only have like a singular choke, especially like an Eichenwald, breaking through that, it creates what I call like the rock'em sock'em robot effect, where you sit there and both sides are just shooting and throwing everything they can through this one gap. And then you have situations where like a Junkrat or a Bastion or something like that, or even like a Hanzo pick or something in the past where you're just trying to shove as much damage as possible and get that first pick that allows you to gain more space. Especially when there's only one place for you to do so. There's no options in which to defend. Now, I'm not saying there can't be like a defense like something a map design that generally benefits the defense more. Like there is an extra side route that allows you to go through, but you're going uphill. For instance, like that would create more options because otherwise, like an Eichenwald, especially like there's that under bridge part, and then there's like the one door just to the side. Like both of those lead to the same place essentially. So fighting through that space is tough, and uh, you don't want to create a rock'em sock'em effect where everybody's just shoving as much damage as possible and just hoping somebody falls. Like, you want to create situations in terms of map design of just saying like, hey, what are the if this option doesn't work, can I use option, can I if I can't use option A, can I use option B or C? And realistically on the defense side, you're going to want to have someone watch those angles. Uh cuz otherwise, yeah, like you don't you want to have that sort of player choice. And I understand that maybe understandably when they first created the game, they didn't expect the way Overwatch to turn into be, but because games are an iterative process, you discover new things along the way. And Overwatch is a very proactive game that people like to be proactive about. So give them those options that allow them to be more actiony rather than defensive.
Like trying to get
Oh
through like
gosh.
the
Yes.
start of Paris is like it could just be brutal sometimes, but it was all intentional, and there was a certain amount of it where we just wanted your team, we wanted to force your team to work together to do that. Sorry, this is going pretty long. I'll hand it off to you in a
See, this
second,
is
Alec.
why
But
this is why I want you here. This is literally perfect. I've got people in my chat
oh,
who are
okay, then I'll
freaking
just
out.
keep going.
They're loving it. Keep going, please.
Okay, and so like you see that, and there's always been complaints about how choke heavy our maps could get, and how
Yes.
defensive the game could feel, and sometimes that was about double barriers, sometimes it was about chokes or just the amount of hit points on one side. But now that we've gone to 5v5 and we've really started looking at the game, like our philosophy on that's changed. We like people being able to move around more. Like we don't really want teams to just stall out in areas, and we've actually started making a lot more symmetrical game modes, and they have less of that stalling out. I do think maybe we've made too many symmetrical game modes at this point instead of like a more attack defense oriented
Yes.
sort of thing, because that was part of the original like DNA of Overwatch. Potential is a huge deal for a lot of players. Players more agency, basically that individual agency, whether it's to just be able to move, to be able to escape, or to make a play. Like it's something that I think for most of the shooter space, playmaking and carry potential is a huge deal for a more attack defense oriented sort
Yes.
of thing, because that was part of the original like DNA of Overwatch, was that style of game mode. But our maps now, they've opened up, they've gotten bigger, there's a lot more flanking routes in them, to where I think it feels a little bit better in a space like that to give players more agency, basically that individual agency, whether it's to just be able to move, to be able to escape, or to make a play. Like it's something that I think for most of the shooter space, playmaking and carry potential is a huge deal for a lot of players. And out of like all of like I think the shooters on the market, like the big competitive shooters, or maybe even big competitive PvP games, Overwatch kind of has some of the lowest carry potential out of all of those, because you are so forced to be to be working with your team in order to be able to make almost any play. Um,
Right.
So this is one of the frustrations that I personally have is that like, like players do want to be able to make plays. They want to be able to have like their sort of own carry potential. But like I said, where 5v5 opens up the map and gives you more options in terms of routes, because of the fact that you require your teammates help a lot more than you ever have before, it doesn't feel like there's much you can do if your teammates are just not able to keep up at the same pace that you are. Uh, yes, you can, take an alternate route, but if you encounter your hard counter, you like especially as a tank, and you're in a DPS, like you can't do anything about that. Um, so, you have options in terms of where you go. You just don't have options in terms of like what you do when you're there, right? And there's so much that requires like teamwork because of the fact that you need to bait cooldowns so much more than ever before, especially the denial abilities of supports that just deny kills from happening and deny, pull people out of making mistakes. So then, especially like when you have those denial abilities, it also creates this sort of problem where players get used to being able to make mistakes and the expectation that they're going to be pulled out of them. So you're making it worse because then players don't even learn through the process. They're like, "Oh, I'm blaming my teammate because you should have thrown the immortality to bail me out of this situation." Because when you're playing in that situation as a tank or anything else, and you get the enemy team to blow their cool denial abilities, and you're waiting and your teammate misses theirs, you're like, "Well, I'm going to blame my teammate because you had one job, right?" Like I got them to use theirs first, which means we had the advantage, and then you use ours, and then like you sort of have that open window of opportunity. Um, you know, eh, I I I agree that like we want to give players agency. I agree there's a certain amount of teamwork that should be expected. Teamwork should make things better, but like individual agency matters a lot. In Overwatch 2, there's not as much individual agency because there's so many ways to deny plays from happening or situations where you're in it. Like I said, when you're fighting against a tank and their raw stats are so high, you just can't do anything about it. Um, yeah, like it doesn't matter if you have more places to move if there's nothing you can do.
And this kind of loosened it a little bit.
Right. So you in general, specifically with map design and also hero design as well, there's kind of more options, more. You've specifically talked about from a defensive perspective, which is really insightful. To where like,
No, well, I think the offense needs more options. We
Right.
set the game up for a defensive perspective of like trying to force the offense through.
Yes.
It is funny, like every time, like most of the level designers still do this. When you think about a map, you always think about it from the attacker's point of view and how they're
Yes.
attacking everything because the defense kind of lines up. But yeah, I don't know if you wanted to add to that, Alex. Sorry, I went long.
that was great.
No, it was great, Aaron. From the heroes standpoint, I think there's a few things. Where tanks need to be positioned balance-wise so that folks feel enticed to play them, but also have a good experience in game and they don't feel too overwhelming. I think at times we undershot. I think at times we overshot that. I think right now we're probably closer to the middle. Some people may say, oh, they're a little still strong in that sense of how resilient they can be. But over the course of the Overwatch 2, you've seen that be in different places, right? I think there's also elements of what players expect from Overwatch 2 heroes, in terms of how many options do they have, but also are they able to have versatility? And I think a lot of the heroes show that, but I think there are other heroes that didn't show that at first, and probably still need a little more help in their like Lifeweaver, right? It's a very, very defensive-oriented hero. A lot of players want to be able to make plays, want to be able to turn the tide, want to feel like their play can at least have more influence over the game, right? And especially in a 5v5 format. So there's a number of things like
Players want to feel like what they do has more impact and what they do matters. And when you design abilities like Lifeweaver, who is a very one-dimensional hero with very limited stuff that they can do and very niche ways to use their abilities, uh, there's not a whole lot of skill expression there that allows you to make plays and feel like you're contributing to the team fight, right? And then you come into situations where you have to buff them repeatedly because their win rate is supposedly not doing well enough. But because there's no margin for error and the stuff that they do is so easy, it's either going to be super overpowered or super broken. There is no in between because of that skill expression is just not there. So a lot of these like different heroes in Overwatch 2, you know, need to be reworked in order to uh, have better skill expression, but also the ability to carry their games through more interesting ways. Because the simple I press button, it gives value is not a great way uh, when, there's not options with that ability. It's just, I'm going to press it and get free value every single time. And then it's frustrating on the other end when you have characters like Genji or Tracer that have a lot of skill expression, but can be easily denied, through the use of these abilities. And, or like even just not using Tracer, like Junker Queen or something. I love Junker Queen. I think she's one of the best heroes that best tanks that Overwatch has ever designed. And it's really frustrating that her ultimate, as amazing as a hero as Junker Queen is, her ultimate is countered by a now 14-second Suzu. Like, and to top it off, like there's already enough heroes in the game that naturally just hard counter that ultimate or can do something about it anyway. So the fact that Suzu can negate it, it's like you're left sitting there holding your, just waiting until you see it before you can act. And that's a frustrating experience to get into. Like you want players to feel like what they do matters. And like currently a lot of like what Overwatch 2 does just doesn't feel that way.
that I think we like. I personally love being able to take cover and use that to my advantage in a match, and hopefully we can get some of that too. Like having some of that space is good.
He might have just like needed more to like say here, but I just don't understand like in an FPS like like saying I like to be able to take cover and use that to my advantage because I'm sitting here thinking to myself, I'm like, how else would you play? But I don't know. Maybe it was just like maybe there was more that he wanted to say.
So
There's no like yes or no from this thing. There's like a lot of different potential outcomes that we could have from these tests. But I think in the world where it does look like it's fairly popular, especially in the world where like, hey, it's brought some players back to the game and it's popular, that would be something that's really good for us, and we would want to try to find a way to keep it. I right now, I don't think the team is open to just shutting off 5v5. That's not really in the cards, Like we don't really see something like that happening. So for anybody that's listening right now, we're not talking about the like, hey, another like really massive change to the game back to the way it used to be. But it doesn't mean that there can't be an addition to the game. And I think it'll depend on like how many people are playing it and how well they retain in that mode to see what we do with it. So like one version is that it's popular enough to where we find a way to just have another queue in Overwatch, and you have a 5v5 queue and a 6v6 queue. And I think in that world, you'd probably have to find a way to do a ranked version of it as well. I don't think 6v6 just gets to be like the casual version. That's the blow up case where it's like it's really big and really popular. I think there's other cases where this could be something like the way we envision Classic. Like coming back to Classic.
I don't mind. I don't mind if 5v5 is the way forward. Uh, if that's what it is, that's what it is. But the problems of 5v5 need to be addressed, right? Like raw defeating someone and using raw stats to do so is a lot less fun than using your abilities. Like whether that means the tanks need new abilities or they need more abilities, uh, that is up in the air. But it's a lot more fun when you know that you can see, hey, the person in front of me just used this ability. I know I can capitalize on that window versus knowing, hey, this tank just used all three of their abilities. They're still going to kill me, and I'm not even going to get them down to half health before they do. Like 5v5, if that's the way that it is, and that's the way Overwatch is going to be, like the issues of super tanks being able to run over individual characters or uh supports being able to negate as much as they do and making the game a lot less fun for everyone else, or the hidden passives that you cannot visually see, so you don't know who to attack and who's weakened. Like these are things that to me need to be addressed to make 5v5 more enjoyable, because currently I've had more fun playing Overwatch Classic than I do playing uh Overwatch 2. And that's my issue is like if it's 5v5 and that's what you want to go with, sure. But allow players to win through expressing their skill and not through forced team play and forced meta picks for stat monsters. Like you gotta address the fact that players want to be able to express that they have agency and are the reason they won their game.
Classic, where it's like, hey, here's something that comes on like a consistent basis that can just be really exciting to jump into for a few weeks, and then you might tire of it and go back to playing normal Overwatch. So it could be like a really like a consistent limited time event mode that we run. And then I think in a world where like not that many people are jumping into it, we could still repeat it, but it might be the way we repeat some of our other limited time events. Like if you look at something like April Fools, or something where it's like, okay, we can bring this back once a year, and we think people will jump into it, and it'll be exciting for them right there. And I don't know, maybe there's a world where nobody plays this thing at all. It's hard for me to imagine, and we just kill it afterwards. That at least as far as like the way people talk about it online, you'd think there's at least enough people out there that would be playing it, but we'll see.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. No, go ahead. Sorry.
Any path forward has to take into account like overall game health. Like Overwatch
Yes.
is in a very healthy state at the moment, so we have to to be responsible shepherds of the game. We have to evaluate what that looks like. Fragmentation is fairly bad for the game overall, so we'd have to look at even things like, hey, if we are going to do 66 in the future, we got custom queues too, maybe. Like maybe open queue just goes away, right?
Yeah.
Maybe some other queues go away. So we have to be like very cognizant of what the overall health of the game is, depending on what we do in the future.
Yeah.
I'm very curious like what they mean by overall health and like kind of defining that a little bit more. Is that just in terms of like retaining player count? Is that in terms of like player growth? Is it in terms of just like queue times for each individual thing? Or like I'm curious to know more of like what the game's health is, because yeah, in terms of like how I would define it, it doesn't quite match up for me, um but yeah, maybe there's something that's it's a metric that I don't fully understand, and I fully admit that. Because I have no doubts. I have no doubts that Overwatch 2 is making money and doing financially well. Like there are so many Kiriko skins, it's physically impossible for them not to be doing well based off of that one hero alone. But uh I'm interested more for me personally, and the way that I rate the health of the game is based off of how fun it is when you are good at it. And for me, like it lost a lot of the fun over the course of its life. I just don't enjoy Overwatch 2 the way I used to enjoy Overwatch 1. And it's not burnout because of the fact that I was super excited to play Classic and I played it a bunch yesterday and I had so much fun and I'm ready to jump back into it again. So it's not that I'm tired of Overwatch. I'm just tired of Overwatch 2.
One quick caveat there. we're not talking about making open queue go away right now. That was just an example of the way to talk about it. It is our third most popular game mode, so I don't want to like alarm all of the open queue players right now.
Of course. It's just in general the concept of like trying to not fragment the player base. And Aaron, it was interesting. I never considered what you said. How even if 10% of the player population currently playing CP6 is decent, but not great. But 10%, if there's new players that don't otherwise normally play Overwatch and we're coming back in, that is a significantly different story because we're talking about bringing people back. And I never thought about that. So that's obviously really interesting. Okay. Anything else, y'all?
I'll let you go. I'll let you move
I think
forward
you just
this
have to
time.
go. Or Aaron will
Alright,
still keep going.
We have to go. Well, see, this is all the lore. Like I love this stuff. You know, we don't get this stuff usually, so I really appreciate it.
And that's sort of the app
It feels like
of playing two tanks in an open queue format, and if things are a little bit different in open queue, like what is that? How's that look? I think Kingmaker is a very natural follow-up to that because it looks at the problem that is very apparent in Max 2, which is, hey, we're 2-1-2, like almost every single game, right? So, okay, well, how do we introduce competitional variety into that sort of format? 5v5 with a Max 2. Well, maybe that role does get a bonus. So maybe that one tank, you're still probably at like maybe a slight disadvantage, but they can at least stand up to two tanks, right? Or that one deep, so and if that we can do 2-2-1 because that one support may have more healing. They may actually be able to perform their role if they are solo, and that's mainly on tank and support in terms of like their function. But DPS still can get a bonus as well. So there's going to be this role bonus where you come in if you are the solo of your role, you're going to just be able to perform that better. Tanks are going to get actually more CC reduction and they'll actually get a little speed, so they're going to be better than they are on live. And DPS gets some cooldown reduction, a little bit of health increase in both DPS and support as well. And then supports they do actually get to heal more and get their cooldowns. So you kind of feel like you're almost a little bit of like the all-star on the team, a little bit of the carry in some sense. That maybe it's a lot of pressure on tanks currently in 5v5. What does that look like when it is DPS or support? Does it change based on the composition? So it should be an interesting experiment. I think if we ever actually did something like Kingmaker, we'd probably do more individualized bonuses rather than these role bonuses. But this is a way to kind of get out there and see how players deal with that.
Right.
Okay, I think two things about this. One, it's a terrible idea. I don't go into more of that. But two, uh, if you ever want to make other people feel the tank experience, like force DPS players to be the one solo person that has the buff stats or the one support that has the buff stats, because then you just essentially shift that target. And here's why it's bad: you shift that target of the most important player from the tank to the DPS or the support. Where if you solo alt that person ever and you take that person out, you're right. You just took out the enemy team's rockstar, but then you've made them a target to where they are the highest priority pick to get. Like in Overwatch 1, the reason why 2-2-2 worked was because of the fact that you were never the highest priority pick on the team. Everybody had an equal ability to contribute to the team. So when you give one role more stats that allow them to be the most important person on the team, you put a target on their back and just say, "Hey, look at this person. You take out them, you win." Right? Like, especially like, let's say hypothetically, um, they decide to keep the DPS passive because they never want to do away with that thing. Right? Uh, if they keep the DPS passive and it's 2-1-2, and there's only one DPS. You kill that DPS, they have no passive. Your team has full healing, and the enemy team does not. Or there's one support. Support can heal a little bit, can heal more than everyone else, but there's only one. So if you take them out, the rest of the team will fall. Every single time you make one person more valuable than the rest through their stats, like hidden or changing, you create a target at that one person, and that's going to create more frustration because of the fact that just like, why am I getting solo ulted every game? It's like, because you're the one they chose. Like, this is the problem of like giving extra stats to somebody, is that you can't make somebody more important than the rest of the team, because then you get this one-dimensional gameplay where you're not thinking to yourself like, oh, maybe I can take out this tank, or maybe I can take out this support, maybe I can take out this DPS. You're literally telling players, hey, target this fool who doesn't understand he's the most important person on the team. So the moment he makes a single mistake, we solo shatter him, we solo grab him, like whatever else. Like, this is the reason why, like, Kingmaker, it sounds like it might be fun in theory, but my bet is the fact that, like, just like when Overwatch 2 came out and I started playing, no matter what, like, a lot of times the way I would climb uh up back into GM or Masters would be to play Zarya as tank, and she was never the best tank. But here's the thing: if I would solo grab their tank every single time and just kill him repeatedly, we'd win the fight, just like Aaron said. Like, my process, because I'm not the best tank player, my thought process was, this game is simple. Like, I understand it, but I know the people I'm fighting do not. And all I'm gonna do is repeatedly ruin this one person's day because of the fact that he doesn't understand that he's the most important person on the team. He doesn't know that. But for me, I'm like, screw it. I could get to the top like 1 to 2% of the player base by just abusing this one like hidden variable that people don't understand. Like I'm fully against the idea of making one person more important than everybody else, but if Kingmaker comes out, that's my theory of what would happen. If it does happen, like please experiment, try it, see what happens.
Right. Also introducing a lot of things that are just good, honest fun. And I'm Mr. Strategy, Honest Overwatch, but I've put in a lot of hours in Junkenstein's lap. So I love fun, whether that's from competitive or silly. Where do you guys stand? Where does the vision of Overwatch see?
I think what we're looking for right now on the team is to how to offer more strategy within Overwatch. More layers of decision making, and whether it be pre-match, whether it be in-match. I know we're still going through a bunch of different things, but that is something we want to add. We want you to feel like there's more decisions in the game that can influence the outcomes. So
Here's one of the parts where I'm just kind of confused because like I fully agree with you. I fully agree with you that we should offer more decision making. I like that idea, but uh, the one-dimensional gameplay that Overwatch 2 is makes me feel like it's the opposite. And this is why, like, when I first kind of like watched this interview, I was confused because I'm like, I thought that I quit the game and I stopped playing it because of the fact that it just wasn't catered to me anymore. I thought that they were trying to find a new audience and I wasn't that anymore. But then when Alex says things like this, I agree with him. I want to see more decision making, right? But you look at things like Magnetic Grenade and how that's changed and how it's basically reverted almost entirely back to the way it used to be. Magnetic Grenade offered less decision making, less choice from the player perspective of both the person using it and the person trying to counter and play against it. So it's like you say that but then you create things where I'm like, "Hey, this is one dimensional and it's really only good to be used one way." So I think that's less fun because now I feel like there's less choice on my end. So, it's same for like Suzu, Life Grip, and Lamp. Like 99% of the time, these things are used as defensive abilities to deny. They're not used in creative ways that offer more decision making. And you just have to burn through support abilities before before you're allowed to make plays. There's a lot of things or the buffing of super tanks. Like, there's a lot of things that happen where I understand and I agree with Alec, but I wish I could talk to him and be like, "Hey, if that's how you feel, why is it set up like this?" Because from a player perspective, at high rank, it's really frustrating. I can understand for friends who play more casually or friends who might not see through like, hey, how everything works. Like I can understand for them why the game hasn't really changed much for them. But for me, like it is a lot less fun to play at my own rank than it ever has been before.
Yeah,
so
and I would.
yeah,
Oh, keep going. Sorry.
that's I think that's really like our current track. That's something that's very very important to the team. At the same time, personally, I believe we also need to find some ways to service folks that want something a bit more less pressured as well. I think Junkenstein's Lab was a good step in that, and I think that's something we're probably actively searching for in the team in the future too.
When you mean
Because
less pressure, can you elaborate on that a little
it's
bit?
it's a little wackier, right?
Gotcha.
There's a little less like seriousness to it. It's a little less sweaty. Hopefully, all those other descriptors can kind of get you in the
Yeah,
mindset.
I got you.
But yeah, something that you just want to come in because you believe in this fantasy of these heroes and they're so evocative and you love like what they represent, and then you're able to utilize them in ways that you may not have previously,
Sure.
and it isn't something that is always like so intense. So I think I'd love to find something like that with Overwatch as well.
Sure.
I will say I agree with that. Like it's a lot of the stuff that I've done in the past that made me really love Overwatch was a lot of especially the Halloween events. There was the one like Lilith boss. Like I remember in Halloween playing that. That was really fun. Junkenstein's Revenge, like all of those things. Like those things were really fun for me. I like the wacky stuff they do, even if they're just short little bursts here and there. And this, if there can be more depth to where it gets harder and progressively harder that you want to keep trying and like if there's things to unlock that are worth it too. Like I like when Overwatch does wacky things. As much as I am a hardcore competitive shooter player in terms of that, like I like the actiony. I like to try and be better each time I play. I like to ask myself what I can do more of and look up videos on how to be better. I like that. But I also like to chill with my friends who aren't as good and play things like Junkenstein's Revenge or, the ridiculous April Fool's events or the other silly things. Like I fully applaud them at like attempting to do that stuff and make stuff that's less sweaty and just fun. Like Lucio Ball when it first came out, I played that a bunch with my friends. Like I think these things are all very positive, and I hope to see more of it. So like I hope when people watch my videos, they're not just sitting there thinking like, oh, he's just a hardcore player. He wants to, you know, make the game all about him and not the casual player. Like, no, there's a lot of like casual stuff, especially like the PvE stuff that I have enjoyed and I would like to see more of.
Sure.
Yeah, and like with Junkenstein's, like it is less serious and competitive. I mean, there's random elements to the mode. Like any sort of randomness kind of like flies in the face of like really serious competition. But for Overwatch as a whole, like I think our vision for the core part of Overwatch for the future is that it's a serious competitive game. Um, and that we put a lot of time into like talking and thinking about the game that way. I think we still doesn't mean that there can't be more strategic depth in an Overwatch match.
This is the part where, like, once again, I agree with Aaron. I agree that, I would like to see Overwatch be a serious competitive shooter, but everything I know from the rank that I played at, eh, and how I played the game had told me that Overwatch was going in the opposite direction. And I quit, like I said, because of the fact that you weren't making it to where it was a more serious competitive shooter. Making projectiles larger and make it so everything was easier to hit was to me a direct net positive for the casual audience and a net negative for everyone in high elo. When I watched SK's video on Lucio, one of the things she mentioned was the fact that she couldn't take as many risks because of the fact that before, it might be harder for someone to get her in the back line or take those big plays and take those big risks. Now it's much easier. And you took what was a good trace, like a good tracer or a good Cassidy before, and then the projectile change happened and you made them great. But the problem is you took the great tracers and the great Cassidys and you made them gods. Like that's why it's a lot less fun, and that's why you have to have your team there, why you have to have that coordination, but then you create this one-dimensional sort of gameplay where it feels like it's not really a competitive serious shooter because now it's just like, "Oh, I can't take risks like I can before," because the margin of error is so low that, like, I'm pretty much guaranteed to throw the fight for my team rather than create a play and create an opening. Like, I like that he said he wants it to be a competitive, serious shooter, but it doesn't feel that way and it doesn't play that way. Like the auto aim denial abilities, the auto aim massive amount of like heals and buffs, like it's not a lot of the stuff just is not creative and there's not a lot of choice there and it's just a lot of free value and there's just a lot of stuff that's easy to do to the point that like the characters that require skill are then the first ones to feel like why would I spend thousands of hours learning to have skill when I could sit in the back and play a character that auto aims or something, you know what I mean? Or like, become the raid boss of whoever happens to be meta at the time. Like or even just like the tank buffs of just being like, "Oh, you know what?" Like to me, as someone who played a lot of Zarya, the 2-second window on her bubble was like a good magic number. Like it was a really good spot to be in. And then when they changed it to 2.5 seconds, 2.5 seconds in a competitive game at like high elo was a really long freaking time. Like most players aren't going to, I don't think, even notice like the slight minuscule changes that patch notes come out with. But players at high elo recognize that stuff a lot more to the point where it's just like you're locked out of fighting for so long because of the fact that you buff these heroes to do what they do already better, and then you close that window of opportunity in which you can capitalize on that mistake. Where you do things like Cassidy's roll, where Cassidy's roll was like a movement tech used to like reload, and then you're like, I'm gonna give it damage reduction as well. So now you can just like negate the stuff that should have killed you before from stepping out of position. And same for Reaper's teleport. If you booped him off an edge, you used to be able to secure a kill, but now he can TP through the air. Like all of these things are catering to saying like, "Hey, we're gonna make the game easier for you. We're gonna dumb it down so that way everybody feels like they can have a little bit more, like they're doing more in the game." But the problem is like when you do that for the audience, for the massive audience, it takes away from the experience of the people who were already good at aiming before. And when I go and I would watch streamers who were those competitive players in the past who are just now Overwatch streamers, to them it's just a job and they treat it like a casual experience because they get paid from playing Overwatch. But like to me personally, it's not a serious competitive shooter, like in any way, shape, or form in comparison to like closer to where it used to be. And I thought it was intentional that you're trying to create a larger, more casual audience because that brings in more people than if you cater to like the, Overwatch OWCS or whatever. Like, once again, I agree a lot with what Aaron and Alex say. I am very confused because of the fact that from my perception as a player, and as a game designer, it felt like they were going the opposite way. So, I don't know. It's interesting.
Like as a development team, we don't like we don't operate that way, you know? Like, and there are times where we'll be like, hey, here's the way the game needs to be. This is what's right for it. But with something this big, I think it's probably more important for our players to know that it's like we like understand that there are like very passionate people on each side of this, and what we are trying to do is we are trying to look at a way that we can to either show them why they like or dislike something and find a way to potentially keep that in the game for them. Like this is us like trying to provide a fun experience, not for maybe as many players as possible, but for at least two different very divergent camps of players.
Right. It gets me.
Like, I do appreciate the fact that Overwatch has had a lot of updates. They've taken a lot of challenges and they've introduced a lot of weird, wacky things to experiment with. I always appreciate iteration more than perfection. I do. However, part of iteration is improving upon what you had last. And there's sometimes where like it just kind of like misses the mark, right? Uh like Roadhog, everyone was complaining about Roadhog for the longest time. And what we did, like I said in other videos, is we removed his weaknesses and then we gave him a pig pen, which is interesting to me because that doesn't deal with the problem that he was having, which is being able to counter things like sleep dart or annonade in a meaningful sort of way. Instead, it just made his one shot have an extra step added to it. And the same for like the Sombra rework, where like the Sombra rework was she was a cheesy hero that was frustrating to play against, but I didn't really find her all that difficult. But then they attached her escape tool also to her ability to cloak, and those don't work well together, right? So it's like there's iteration, but then I look at the iteration and I can't help but question both as a player and as a designer, why, when you know that Overwatch is all about being like, this is your key ability, this is the one that's super important, that if they don't have, they die. And then you're like, oh, we're going to attach Sombra's engage ability to her disengage ability. Like, that right there is stuff like that where I'm like, okay, you iterated and you found something that was better than the old Sombra, but then you made something worse. And I'm just sitting there wondering, like, I'm very confused in terms of just why we did those things. And then it created another problem where because we have super tanks and because Widow's super powerful in 5v5, like when I hopped on during that time, I was just getting assaulted by Ball and Widow. And like I felt like I couldn't do anything because my tank was just repeatedly diving off the map over and over again. And I remember that game because that was the Doom game that I was just like, screw it, I'm done. Like I don't want to play this. This isn't fun. I don't like being hijacked by a tank for 20 minutes. Like it's not enjoyable. Um, so yeah, like I'm all for frequent iteration. I am all for taking challenges, and sometimes as a developer you're going to make something and it's not going to be great. It's not going to be received well. But just like a stand-up comedian going up to test material in front of a crowd, like the boos and the silence are enough to tell them that they bombed, that we don't need to hammer them down on it. Like sure, but it does need to be fixed and addressed later so that way it's better. And like watching this interview and stuff, like I do like some of the things that Overwatch team does, but in terms of like design and balance and how they see things, like I fully agree with a lot of what Aaron and Alex say. I just don't agree with how they went about trying to design the game around those things or how they thought they were going to get there. Because to me, Overwatch 2 is a lot of a step backwards from Overwatch 1 because I lost that individual player agency. It became more of a team game that I was required to rely on my team for everything. Not just like in Overwatch 1 where teamwork helped you win. Overwatch 2, it's required to win. And if you know that your team is just not able to pull their weight, if the tank is just constantly feeding, or if the supports don't want to change to complement what the tank needs, like you just kind of get screwed a lot of times. And like that's the frustrating part of for me from and I'm sure for other players going from Overwatch 1 to Overwatch 2 is you feel the magic is gone. You don't have that same excitement. And it's not to say that you don't love Overwatch or you wanted to stop playing because for a lot of people that I've seen for myself and on Reddit included, there's a lot of people who are enjoying Overwatch Classic because they're just like, "Oh my god, I haven't played forever. Now I want to play all weekend." Like I am curious as to how much of an overlap there is between like like the 5v5 players who are playing 5v5 and the 6v6 players and how much of the 5v5 players just don't care either way, and how many actual passionate people there are for 5v5 versus 6v6. Because even if we go to 6v6, I've said this in my videos before, even if we go to 6v6, that is not the magic bullet that we need, because there's the healing is still out of control. The immortalities are still a pain in the ass to work around. The DPS passive is still invisible, and it's still an annoying band-aid fix to the problem that is overtuned healing. Like 6v6 is not a magic silver bullet, but it will alleviate the pressure of one tank constantly getting the blame and becoming the most important person on the team. Like, yes, it will fix it, but like if it's not, even then, if it comes out as 6v6, but we still have all the same problems, will it be better? I don't know. I think so, but you still have other problems for sure. But games are supposed to be easy to understand, difficult to master. And Overwatch 2 has so many situations where you are blaming your teammates, you are blaming the game because that's how it's designed. And some things are improvement, like reverting flashbang back to like sort of what it used to do is a great thing. Like I'm super happy they did that because now it feels like that skill-based matchup between a Cassidy and Tracer is back again. Uh, but there's a lot of things that still to this day that just like aren't addressed that to me as a longtime player, like it's very frustrating because of the fact that I want to come back to Overwatch, but the dumbing down of the game, the making everything easier, the making everything all about healing immortalities and just like pumping out massive amounts of damage and massive amounts of healing, like it's not fun. I can't secure kills like I used to. I can't make plays like I used to. Like I said, as a tracer player, my goal isn't to try and make plays. It's to try and bait cooldowns so that way I alleviate pressure off of my team most of the time. I can't just go in and outplay someone. Like I can't even like whittle someone down and take away some of their health because everyone just naturally has like this healing factor that turns on. Like there's a lot of things that were added to the game that has dumbed down the experience for the high level player experience that to me and to maybe some others, we are confused when we hear that you want Overwatch to be a competitive shooter, but then also super buff tanks and increase projectile size to make everything easier to hit because those are polar opposites in terms of like what you say versus like what you did. So, there is stuff that I appreciate. I do appreciate them doing the interview. I do appreciate them being willing to make changes and to have these conversations. And I do respect Spilo a lot in terms of like his in terms of his like sort of like game design knowledge for someone who I don't think worked in the industry before. Like some people have a good sort of knack for it. Like I do appreciate a lot of the stuff that we do, but for me, like I'm just trying not to come off like an asshole, but the game just isn't the same sort of like excitement that it used to be. I want to be able to make plays again. I want to be able to throw a really good sticky and kill someone without having an immortality immediately negate it. I want to be able to throw it a grab and not have it just be negated because of the fact that a support 30 meters back pulls them out of it. Like I want what I do in the game to matter again. And I want stuff to die. I want it to be difficult. I want it to be easy to understand and difficult to master. I don't want to have, two or three of my friends online to group up with in order to feel like I could confidently carry my games. Um, if Overwatch can address this stuff, like I said, whether it be 5v5 or 6v6, if you can find a way to do and address the pain points of 5v5, sure, make it a skill based game again. But if you can't, then it's just like, it's not even a 5v5, 6v6 thing. It's just a different game that isn't meant for me anymore. So I don't know. I'll be curious to see like what happens when 6v6 comes out. I'll be playing classic with my friends while it's out because I really enjoy um as clunky as it is, and I'll make a video on that too. As clunky as it is, at least I can now see that when like someone makes a mistake, whether it be a tank, a support, or a DPS, and even if they're a counter to me, in Overwatch 1, you can punish them for it. Like it's extreme reward and extreme risk, but I like that. Um, Overwatch 2 doesn't have that anymore. Overwatch 2, there are no mistakes. Like, it's strictly a game that has been about making sure that everything is easier. And that's not necessarily, in my opinion, the best direction to go. I'll be curious to see what happens. I'll be curious to see where it goes. I don't think I'll be coming back to like Overwatch 2 anytime soon in terms of like the changes I've seen to like the balance patch notes and stuff. Like it still doesn't excite me. It's still the same old bullshit. So I'll be waiting until 6v6, and when that comes out, I'll probably give that a try and see how well they did. But yeah, until then, like as an 8 year long player, like I'm one of the people who's not going to come back except for classic. But if you're trying to get players like me back into the game, like I don't know, maybe this video will help you, maybe it won't. Uh, Once again, I appreciate Aaron, Alec, and Spilo. Good video, good interview. Um, yeah, let's see what the future of Overwatch holds, huh?